Hey guys, it's Mr. Hooper. How are you doing? Hope you guys are doing well. Quick update on our little baby. He's doing great. Actually, he's getting downstairs right now, getting his morning breakfast, and he's doing really awesome. And I can't wait for you guys to meet him. If you want, on the main page of this little course website, you can look to the right. There's a little announcement that says his name, which is Adam John. Just click on it, and you can see a picture of his cute little face. And the good news is he's really handsome because he looks just like his dad. Um, anyway, let's get on to the course. I'm going to try to not be as charming and funny as I usually am with this presentation. I just kind of want to get right to the point for you guys, so it's easy to understand what we're talking about. So let's get going. Welcome to macroeconomics. And I think before we start talking about macroeconomics, the first thing we should probably do is understand what exactly is macroeconomics as opposed to microeconomics. So for that, I kind of have this little slide here, which I think might help. Think of micro really as focusing on individual consumers and producers, right? Micro's whole purpose is to understand how the individual person, the individual household, we use that word sometimes, or the individual business makes decisions. And that's really what we spent the whole last semester doing. We understood how one company decides to shut down or not shut down, or we understood how a consumer decides to buy a good or doesn't decide to buy a good. But it was all focused on how the individual person makes a decision, essentially. Remember, that's the study of economics. What is decision making? Macro is very different. Macro really tries to take all of those individuals together and kind of smush them into one group and create this thing that if you guys listen to the news a lot, you'll hear them referred to as quote, quote, the economy. This massive thing that includes hundreds and hundreds of millions of people and trillions of dollars. So macro's focus is on taking all of those individuals and putting them together to create this massive thing called the economy. And if you think about it visually here, kind of think of it this way. Think of micro as one individual tree and macro as the entire forest, all the trees coming together to make something much more substantial and much more complex. Okay, there are two models that we're going to learn today that kind of help get us started with macroeconomics and kind of give us a quick understanding of what it's all about. The first is what's called the business cycle. And the business cycle is pretty simple, actually. No big surprise. It's a graph. How else would we do anything in economics? This is our first, by the way, of about 9 or 10 graphs we're going to learn in macro this semester. So you guys can put a big star next to this one, and we'll get started with it. What we're really measuring with the business cycle basically is economic growth. Now, you don't exactly know what economic growth is, and there's a specific definition for it. But basically, let's put it this way. I'd like to call it economic goodness, right? If economic growth is happening, that means the economy is doing really well. And if the economy is not happening, if things are going really poorly, then economic growth is going to go down. That's kind of an oversimplified explanation, but for right now, that's fine. We're actually going to spend time on that term, economic growth, later this semester. But for now, think of it as economic goodness, all right? And what you're going to notice about the business cycle is that it actually looks a lot like a loop-de-loop here. It kind of goes like a roller coaster. You'll notice that it goes up and down, and of course, as economists, we have to name all of those things. The lower points are what are called troughs, and the highest points are what we call peaks. Now, if we were to say right now, we're probably between coming out of one of those troughs and headed hopefully toward a peak in our economy right now. What I don't want to do just yet is explain why we get too much into these things, but I just kind of want you to know what they are. So the troughs are the low parts, and the peaks are the high parts. And when we're coming out of a trough, hopefully right now, as a matter of fact, that's what's called an expansionary period. And we're going to use that word a lot this semester, so kind of get used to using as the economy gets stronger, even if it's not great yet, if it's going the right direction, that's called an expansionary period. And if we were where we were 2 years ago, when we were crashing into a hole, that's what's called a contractionary period. What's kind of important about the business cycle, it's not very complicated as you can see. What's kind of important to realize about it though is that all the things that we're going to learn about this semester in this economy, in this class, are how to make the economy stronger. How does the government make the economy stronger? How do private people make the economy stronger? Private companies make the economy stronger. But what we have learned over time is that no matter what we do, we still end up with highs and lows and highs and lows. And what's the implication for that? The implication for that is a couple things. Before we get to that, I wanted to show you the unemployment rate for the last, good 65 years or so. The unemployment rate isn't exactly the same thing as economic growth, but I think it makes sense that when the unemployment rate is high, the economy's not strong, and when it's low, the economy is strong. So if you want to get a quick picture of the actual business cycles our country's experienced over the last 65 years, this is a pretty good example of it. And unfortunately, as you can see at all the way to the right, we are at a very high point of unemployment. Really only the early 1980s was the only point that it was a little bit higher. So it looks like overall we've had about 9 business cycles since the end of World War II. And that's the actual data, so it kind of gives you a real picture of it. So what does this mean now that we know the business cycle, and why does the business cycle seem to have these ups and downs? The truth is we don't exactly know, which is partly because the economy is such a massive thing and so complicated that it's hard for us to really pinpoint exact reasons. What we suspect it might be the case is that when you're at those peaks that we just looked at a minute ago, people tend to do crazy things. For example, there was a famous website at the time of the late 1990s called pets.com. And pets.com basically was one of a lot of different websites that started around that time that very famously crashed and burned shortly thereafter because a lot of money was dumped into things that really didn't make a lot of sense. The housing market has been a really good example of this, where the housing market for the last 20 years, definitely the last 10 years, was so great that people just started dumping money into it like crazy. And because that's the case, eventually when you start making crazy decisions, things are eventually bound to crash. And then the opposite, when the economy wasn't going so well, people were more careful. And little by little, they made wiser decisions and the economy started to grow back. Is that a perfect explanation? No. But it's sort of a step in the right direction to explaining why this business model looks this way. Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is this. Really, the whole purpose of this class is not to learn how to get rid of that business cycle. We're always going to have highs and lows in an economy. What we are going to try to learn how to do is to get rid of the extremes, not to have peaks that reach so high that they're bound to come crashing down in these deep, deep troughs, or we might maybe call a trough a little more like a recession, or even a really bad trough, a depression. Okay, so that's a little something on the business cycle. Excuse me. Okay, the second model we're going to learn about today is what's called the circular flow model. And the circular flow model is a little bit more complicated. But essentially what it does is explain how it is our economy keeps going. In other words, when you spend money, how come that money doesn't just stop? It doesn't just go into a box and stay there. How does that money find its way through the economy so that once you spend it, it goes on to make something else and be used in a lot of different ways? And maybe if I show you the graph, or the chart this time, no graph, it'll make a little more sense. Basically, there are 2 markets in the world that we use. The first market is one that we learned about last semester. They're called factor markets, or markets for resources, things like land and labor and capital. And the other kind of market is what's called a product market. And we learned about that most of last semester. That's where people buy and sell goods and services. There are also really 2 players in the economy. The first are households. We've used that term before, and that's kind of the average person, the average family. And what do households do? Households buy and consume things, and they also sell something. They sell a factor, a very important factor. Specifically, they sell labor. And then there's the other player. The other player is called a firm. And firms are companies that produce things. And what do firms do? Well, firms produce and sell goods and services, and they also use up or buy those factors that households produce? Labor. And that sounds a little confusing. Maybe some arrows will help kind of straighten things out. So if you look in the bottom there, you'll see there's two arrows, an orange one and a green one. The orange one, I like to say, represents stuff, actual things moving around the economy. And see if this makes sense. Stuff, in this case, products, moves from the firm to the product market. So goods and services, things like soda and towels and computer software and all sorts of stuff that gets produced by a firm moves to the product market. That's where it's going to be sold. And then, of course, who buys those things in a product market? That'd be the household. And what do they buy? Goods and services. Okay? Now, once they get the stuff, goods and services, the household then turns around and sends something back to the firms. They send back in exchange, specifically labor, also land and capital, though. And then the firm takes those things and turns them into production, a factor of production, and uses them to make new goods and services, which, if you follow my cursor, then go back into the product market. So there's this loop of stuff that's always going on and never ever continues to stop. Now, let's just check the green arrow out now because I think that's a little easier to understand. That's how money flows through the economy. So this orange arrow kind of explains how stuff flows through the economy. Things, goods and services, labor. Here's how money flows through. In the product market, think of it this way. Firms take in money when they sell things. You guys already know that term. It's called revenue. And when they sell things, they then take that money and they spend it on factors of production. Again, specifically labor, wages. Don't worry so much about rent and profit for right now. We'll get to that later. But basically, they spend it on wages. They spend it on people. People then use that money as income because they've been working for those firms. And they take that income and guess what they do? They buy stuff. They buy those goods and services. They spend it. So this, guys, is kind of a short version of the product of the circular flow model. Now, what's really important to understand is, out of all of this, how does this circulate through? How does money move around the economy? Take a look at it carefully. If you see other examples of the circular flow model, you're also going to sometimes see the government included in this. We'll talk about that more later, but for right now, let's keep it as simple as we can. We're just going to talk about households and firms. Now, what I'd like you guys to do is to try some practice questions. You may want to actually have this printout, which you're going to have in front of you. By the way, Mr. Malden should have given you a worksheet. You may want to have this printout in front of you when you do this, this next part. And that is some practice questions. To practice, let's see what we're going to do is take each statement here and decide whether the statement is true or whether the statement is false. And if the statement is false, take time to change it and make sure that your answers match the answers, hopefully when you're done, on the next slide. We're going to stop here because this slide is available without my narration, also on the site. And you can go right to this slide and try these questions without me sitting here and trying to talk you through it. Okay, but here we go. There are 4 statements. Determine which of those statements are true and which of those statements are not true. All right, guys, good luck. And feel free to call if you have any questions.